A mystery buried beneath the floorboards. The house on Redfield Pike sat alone at the edge of a small Ohio town, its porch sagging over a square of cracked concrete and last summer's weeds. The mailbox leaned to one side, the number plate rusting at the corners. The roofline was a long, tired shrug against the sky. When the afternoon sun slid behind the mill stacks and the wind came down from the hills, the whole place seemed to hold its breath, like a swimmer under cold water, waiting it out. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? On a Thursday in late October, a pair of headlights rolled up the gravel. Grant Nolan stepped out first, jacket zipped to his chin. His partner, Lena Hart, followed with a box of kitchen plates and a grin that looked brave. The air smelled like leaves and wood smoke from a neighbor's stove. Somewhere to the south, a dog barked and kept barking. It was just after 5, the clouds low, twilight coming fast. They unlocked the door and felt the way old hinges carry a memory of every hand that has ever turned them. Inside, the boards complained under their steps. The entryway opened to a narrow hall, a tight living room, a dining room with a single window facing a cornfield gone gold and gray. The kitchen had a wide sink, a rust ring, a back door that led to a small porch, and an oily driveway. Under the sink, a drip ticked in the quiet like a metronome. The place had sat empty for months. It smelled like dry paper and cold iron. They worked until 9. Boxes stacked by the front window, a blanket over the sofa, 2 mugs on the sill cooling in the draft. At 10:30, with the town gone to sleep, a sound rose from beneath the living room floor. Not the subtle groan of wood and nails, not the whisper of pipes. A dragging sound. Slow, deliberate. Something heavy shifting across packed earth. Lena looked at Grant, eyes wide. The sound stopped. They listened until the heater switched on and the vents began to sigh. By midnight, they laughed, said the place was settling, and crawled into bed. At 2:17 a.m., a single knock touched the underside of the bedroom floor. Then, nothing. Then 2 knocks, spaced like a code. Grant held his breath. The street outside was empty. The red digital clock watched them from the dresser. A car passed on the pike and faded. When another knock came, softer, Lena sat up. The heater cut off. All the house went still. They waited. The air grew heavy, as if rain was pressing its face to the windows. When the knock did not come again, they slept in fits until dawn and woke with headaches. Friday carried them into town, groceries at the corner market, a decent breakfast at a diner with a neon sign that buzzed even in daylight. The server, a woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Ivy, asked where they were moving in. When Lena told her Redfield Pike by the old mill road, the server blinked, paused, and said she remembered that place. Her aunt once called it the house that kept secrets. Ivy said it with a soft smile. She cleared their plates and did not come back as quickly. They returned after noon. Outside the living room window, a tractor pulled through the far field. Inside, cold air coiled in a strip across the floor like a river. The boards by the front window felt loose underfoot. One plank near the center gave a little when pressure shifted onto it. That night, the dragging sound came again, moving slow under the living room, then pausing as if to listen. At 2:11 a.m., 5 knocks. This time in a rhythm that was almost a message. Grant pressed his palm to the floor. The boards were cool. Beneath his hand, he felt a faint tremor, as though something living drew breath in the dirt. Saturday morning brought a step that no one could mistake for settling wood. A single pace under the hallway, toward the bedroom, then quiet. In the afternoon, Grant called a local contractor named Gus Rourke. Gus had a voice like a gravel road. He could come by on Monday and take a look beneath. In the meantime, Grant went to the hardware store and bought a pry bar, a headlamp, and a box of screws. Gus would roll his eyes, but Grant could not sit with the sound another night. He started in the living room. He marked the loose board with painter's tape. He loosened the nails until the plank lifted by an inch. The space beneath was dark and close. The day's pale light slipped through in a thin sheet. Lena held a flashlight. Dust lifted and spun in the beam like snow in slow motion. They saw stone piers, dry earth, a forgotten spoon, a mauled tennis ball, the sag of old insulation. The flashlight found a chain length draped across a beam, a piece of iron like a crude hook. A child's glass marble stuck in a hard ridge of dirt, frozen there by time. They widened the opening. They set the boards aside in a careful stack. Lena lowered the light again, and the beam showed a strange smoothness to the soil, as if that portion of the crawl space had been scraped flat by a careful hand. Close to the beam sat a small rectangle of something darker than earth. Grant lay on his stomach and reached down. His fingers found a wooden box with a rusted latch. The wood was dry as bone. He pulled it up, both of them breathing shallow as if the air around it did not want to be disturbed. They opened it on the coffee table. Inside lay a stack of photographs tied with string, faces in stiff poses, a boy without a smile, a woman with a soft mouth and tired eyes. The edges of the photos were singed. The backs had pencil notes and blocky letters that listed first names and a word that read border. Under the photos was a folded page, brittle and yellow. The writing curved and leaned, a hand trying to stay neat that failed at the end. It said a name. It said Redfield Pike. It said the floor keeps talking. It asked the reader to forgive. It asked the reader to listen at 2 in the morning and to count. They counted that night. 2:10, 2:12, 2:14. At 2:16, the knocks began. 4 pauses, then 3. A space. 2. A space. 1. It felt like the pattern of someone who had been alone too long and had decided the only way to be known was to repeat the same request until the wood itself learned the sound. Lena wept without sound. Grant whispered that they would call the sheriff in the morning and that he would not mock them. He said this and realized he did not believe it. Sunday at 9, they called the county sheriff. A deputy named Cole arrived with a flashlight and a polite look that carried the weight of many long nights. He listened to their story, then crouched by the opening in the living room floor. He said animals make strange sounds in old crawl spaces. He said raccoons can sound like a person trying to remember how to be human. He said he would leave a number for a wildlife guy who could trap and relocate. Then he nodded at the box on the table. He asked if they had found it here. He asked if he could take a photo for the file. He did not ask to take the box, but he wrote down the names on the back of the pictures. He told them to keep the floors closed at night for safety. He drove away with his lights off. Sunday night carried the cold in early. The wind slid along the siding and found new paths into the house. At 1:50, a light knock came, almost polite. At 2, a short run of knocks like a breath taken too fast. At 2:14, a scratch on the joist that ran under the far side of the room. The scratch traveled toward them. Lena stared at the gap in the floor where the boards had been pried up and placed back. Through the seams, she saw a thread of darkness that did not look like any darkness she had seen. When she reached for Grant, his hand was shaking. On Monday, Gus arrived in a faded jacket. He was 2 steps into the living room when he set his tool bag down, knelt, and peered through the seams. He told Grant to move the couch and coffee table into the dining room. He measured the span between beams and tacked up a bright work light. He pulled 3 boards clean. The light pushed back a tide of gray dust and old air. The crawl space was shallow, maybe 2 feet high. Farther in, beyond the beam, there was a place where the earth dipped down with a shape not made by settling. Gus lay flat and angled the light. The dip was an oval. The soil there had been disturbed in a way that ignored time. Nobody breathed. Gus slid the flashlight in and tapped the dirt with a screwdriver. The tip sank. He brushed at the surface. The line of a seam appeared. He brushed some more. Wood showed. An edge, then a corner. He cleared a small lid of planks banded with wire that had rusted to dust. He said he would not touch another thing until the county came. He stood and dusted his hands, and in that motion, they saw he had been around death before and recognized when a room had been asked to host it. Sheriff Buckley came with Deputy Cole and a woman from the coroner's office named Dr. Alvarez. A woman from the county records office arrived too, Ivy Delaney from the diner with a badge clipped to her sweater. Everyone stood with the work light buzzing and the smell of old wood warming in the heat. Dr. Alvarez knelt by the opening. She looked at the oval in the floor and her face went still. She asked for a moment. She asked if anyone here had touched anything other than the loose boards. Gus said no. Grant and Lena said they had found the small box only. The sheriff asked to see the photographs. He asked if anyone had come by in the last few days. He walked the hall with slow steps and stood by the bedroom door for a long time. By late afternoon, they lifted the lid. The wire broke like sugar. The planks rose with a sigh. Cold air reached up like a hand. Under the lid lay a layer of waxed cloth. The cloth had been tied with twine. The knots were hard as stone. When they were cut, the cloth relaxed and the contents pressed upward in a small release, the way a held breath will release when a boat settles on water. Dr. Alvarez parted the cloth. Inside lay bones arranged with care, a skeleton placed on the right side, knees drawn as if sleeping. The skull was turned away. The left hand held a small object that first looked like a coin. It was a ring without a stone. Near the ankles lay a vial sealed with something black that might have been pine pitch. The pitch had cracked. A long strand of hair had floated in the oil trapped there and now curled in the cold air like a question. Even without the year, the whole scene spoke of a time when people used their hands to make things last and used the dark to keep things quiet. No one spoke for a long time. Then the sheriff began to talk the way a man will speak in a church, because he does not know if words can move like water, and so he tries to set them down like stones. He said the room was a scene. He said no one was to stay the night. He said the remains would be taken with care to the county building. Dr. Alvarez nodded. Deputy Cole stood by the front door and wrote a neat report. The wind shifted and blew a smell into the room that did not belong to the house. Wet stone, old ash, cold cellar earth. They slept that night in a motel by the interstate. The heater hummed. The room smelled like ginger cleaner and old fabric. At 2:13 a.m., Lena woke with the knowledge that the house was awake and that something on a low frequency had finally found new space to move. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the black eye of the television. Grant sat up and did not pretend to be sleeping. They did not speak. They held each other and watched the red numbers step forward into the new day. Morning gave them coffee and a call from Sheriff Buckley. The remains would be analyzed. The ring and the vial had been cataloged. The small wooden box had been taken into evidence after a phone call with the county attorney. Ivy from Records wanted to meet them at the courthouse. She said there was something they might want to see. She spoke in the careful tone of a person who understands that paper can weigh as much as iron. In a room that smelled like old ink and dust, Ivy set a ledger on the table. She turned pages with a flat palm. She stopped at a map that showed Redfield Pike and the original parcel that held their house. The name written there was Rowan. Beside it, another name, Talbot, marked the next parcel and a small notation that read, boarding house in spiky script. Ivy told them the Rowan family built the house when the mill road went in. She told them the Talbot place had burned down long ago. She told them a man named Ephraim Talbot kept his back door open to drifters and workers during certain months. Ivy found another entry and tapped it with a short nail. The note said that a boarder named Vince Lowe was last seen on Redfield Pike, that he had worked a few days at the mill, that he had been paid in cash, and that he had taken to playing a harmonica on the porch when the sun went down. Grant asked the question that wrapped itself around the soft parts of the heart. If Vince had vanished here, and if a grave had been found under the floor, then who had done the burying? Ivy said the county had never solved that case. She said the mill was loud and that people forgot faces when the day was long. She said she wished she had better words. She slid another document across the table. It was a letter from a relative of the Rowans, written in angry strokes that dug into the page. It said the floor kept talking. It said a boarder would not be quiet. It said a prayer would not close. It said a ring kept turning up in the crack by the front window. It said mercy is not the same as silence. Late that afternoon, after a lunch they did not taste, after a walk past the old feed store and the post office with its flag roped tight in a cold wind, they drove back to the house with permission to collect clothes and a few things. The front door stuck for a second, then gave. The work light had been turned off. The living room felt hollow without it. The opening in the floor was covered in sheets of thick plastic taped down at the edges. A small marker flag had been set in the corner by a support pier. The silence had a pressure to it, like the inside of a shell. They gathered what they needed: coat, boots, a photograph that could travel. In the bedroom, Lena paused by the closet mirror and looked at herself in the dim light. Her face seemed older. When she stepped back into the hall, she felt a cool stream of air touch her ankle. The plastic in the living room shifted, not with a draft, with weight. Grant stared at the taped edges. A sound came from beneath the plastic, a small roll like a marble moving over wood. A pause, another roll. Something round found the lowest point and settled. They did not move. The round thing rolled again toward the taped seam by the wall and stopped. Grant peeled up a corner of plastic. He shone his phone light into the gap. The floorboards were closed there, sealed with new screws. Between two boards, in the narrow wedge of shadow where wood met wood, something silver gleamed. He slid a table knife into the seam and worked it gently. A thin silver chain lifted free. At the end of the chain hung a locket, oval and smooth, the hinge just visible, the metal worn by a thumb that had rubbed it 1,000 times. He laid it on the plastic. The chain trembled. The room felt crowded, though they were alone. He did not open the locket in that living room. He and Lena stepped onto the porch where the cold air moved and where the day still belonged to trees and trucks and distant dogs. He eased the hinge and opened it. Inside was a small photo of a young woman with eyes that held an expression neither sad nor content. On the opposite side, tucked behind the thin glass, a fold of paper with a line in cramped writing. It said, "I am under the boards." It did not say a name. It did not ask for help. It simply told the truth. They drove to the sheriff's office and handed over the locket. Sheriff Buckley studied it and did not hide the way his jaw set. He wanted to take a statement and did. He asked if they had found anything else, and they told him no. He said he would bring the locket to Dr. Alvarez. He would look up anyone in the Rowan or Talbot line still in the county. He suggested again that they not sleep in the house. He pressed his hands flat on the desk and stared at them as if to make the suggestion into a command without calling it one. For 3 nights, they stayed at the motel. They tried a rental cabin by the lake for a night after that. The quiet there felt honest and wide, the kind of quiet that comes with water and trees. Then at 2:17 a.m., a soft knocking touched the cabin floor, a sound like someone politely reminding them that their lives were not yet allowed to return to ordinary time. They left the cabin before dawn, coffee in paper cups, the lake a black sheet beside them. They did not go back to the motel. They drove the long way to Redfield Pike and sat in the car across from their house with the heater on low. In the square of the front window, something moved. Not a person. The faint shiver of the blind string pulling toward the floor and lying still again. The county worked fast. The ring had no inscription. The vial held oil with traces of resin. The strand of hair was human. Age could not be answered in a number without a year to point to, but Dr. Consistence. Alvarez said, "The bones belonged to a woman." She said there were faint marks on the ribs that could have been left by someone who believed in folk protection. She said there was no obvious trauma that a body would keep forever. She said that sometimes the way a person is placed tells the story more clearly than any mark. She said this and looked tired, as if the bones had placed their own weight on her shoulders and asked to be carried. While the lab worked, Ivy called again. She had found a newspaper clipping that mentioned a girl from the Talbot place who went missing around harvest when the mill ran all night. The article did not say where she worked. It said she had come north on a train. It said she played a hymn on a harmonica when she could not sleep. Lena's face changed at that. In the still moments between knocks, a thin note had drifted through the floor on the second night. They had believed the sound was in their heads. The clipping made the sound real. The idea of a hymn moving through wood and dirt made the room colder even in memory. They made one more trip into the house with the sheriff's permission. Grant wanted a box of books he had stored in the bedroom closet. Lena wanted a sweater that hung on the hook by the back door. The front yard was a map of their footsteps through frost. The heater in the house had been set to low by a deputy to keep pipes from freezing. They walked through with purpose, did not linger, did not look at the plastic. In the hall, Lena stopped again, listening. A single knock came, thin as a coin flicked on glass. She whispered to the floor. She said they had seen the locket. She said a name would help. She said they would try. The floor did not respond, which felt like an answer. That night, they returned to the motel. They did not sleep until dawn. In the morning, the sheriff called with a small piece of news that felt larger than it was. A distant cousin of the Rowan line had recalled a story from an aunt. The aunt had said there was a time when a girl stayed at the house for a few days. She had been given a bed in the room by the front window. She had made tea in the kitchen and had washed her cup and set it to dry. Then, sometime before midnight, she had stepped outside and had not been seen again. The aunt believed the girl had run from someone who would not let her rest. The aunt believed the house had seen too much and decided to hold one thing back and keep it safe. The story had been told in pieces. The cousin's voice on the phone shook as he read his notes aloud. On the sixth night away from the house, they dreamed the same dream. A floorboard lifted like a lid, a pale wrist reached through, not a frightening hand. A hand that had waited long enough and now expected to be met halfway. In the dream, they placed their palms under the wrist and lifted gently, and the wrist withdrew, like a shy creature retreating to a burrow. They woke at the same minute. They stared at the ceiling. They cried a little without drama. They listened to the heater and made a decision. They met the sheriff mid-morning. They wanted to hold a small moment in the living room. They wanted a minister of any kind, not for a sermon, for a human voice speaking to a human story with a spine that refused to bend to silence. The sheriff called Reverend Pike from a church near the square. Reverend Pike had a bright scarf and patient eyes. He held a small book and he stood by the plastic in the living room, and he spoke in a clear tone that carried to the corners. He said a name, even though he did not know it. He called the person under the boards by the name she would have given herself when she left home. He said that name was known now. He said a door could open for souls as well as for bodies. He asked permission to set the locket on the plastic while he spoke. No one said no. When he finished, the heater cut off. The room grew so quiet they could hear the blood in their ears. Then the plastic settled a fraction as if a weight had shifted. A soft knock came from under the far beam under the front window. 2 knocks followed, spaced like a heartbeat. Then the house exhaled. A loose blind string tapped the glass once. The room kept its quiet. The quiet this time felt less like weight and more like a field after rain. Dr. Alvarez called a day later with one more detail. A lab in Columbus had extracted a partial profile from the hair and had compared it with a small set of people who had submitted to a county project for unidentified remains. The partial read did not match anyone yet. She believed a match might come. She said hope was not a strategy, but it was a way of walking from the bed to the door when the morning was cold. She said she would call if the computer found a hand to hold on the other side of that line. They hired Gus to install new supports, to level the living room, to replace the old boards with a layer of fresh pine over the original plank. He sealed the cut opening and left a small square section that was removable only with a special driver bit. He told them houses remember. He told them the living rarely know how many hours of the day they spend walking above the stories of the dead. He wiped his hands and left a roll of underlayment by the wall with a nod that felt like respect. Grant and Lena moved back in near the end of November. The first night was a study in breath and quiet. The heater clicked and hummed. The trees de-leafed themselves against the windows. At 2:13 a.m., a soft knock came, far away, like rain beginning. Another followed, closer to the front window. Then nothing. A long nothing that felt like a hallway in a school after the bell. They slept. In the morning, they made coffee and opened the front door and let the cold rush in and then slam back out again. Their house was only a house. The floor under their feet felt steady and less like a lung. Some evenings, around 10, Grant would take his mug to the front window and look at the cornfield gone to stubble. A coyote would cross the far end of the field as if it had been written to do so, and the script could not be changed. The wind would lift the blind string and lay it back down. Then, from somewhere in the walls or under the joists, the faintest run of notes would drift and fade. Not a tune he could name. A hymn without a lyric. A line without words that sounded like a person easing into rest after standing all day by a door that no one else could see. They still kept the motel number folded in a book by the bed. They kept a box of clothes in the trunk through the first snow. They told themselves that caution is a form of respect. When they drove past the diner on Main, Ivy would wave them in. She asked every few weeks if anything had changed. They said only that the house felt different now, and that the nights were sometimes long but never empty in the way that makes you think about the road at 2 a.m., and the way it glows like wet tin. In January, Sheriff Buckley called with a voice that was careful. He said a woman downstate had been building her family tree for years and had shared a small amount of information with a nonprofit that helps identify unknown persons. A connection had been made to a line that touched this county for a season and then moved on. The name he gave them was simple and strong. When he said it, the sound had a weight that made even the air in the kitchen lean in. He did not say the year, he did not say the city, he said only that a name matters and that this was the right one. He asked if he could come by with Ivy to leave a copy of the paper for their records. He said the county wished to thank them for opening the floor and for standing in hard places without shouting. That night, just before 2, a soft sequence of knocks touched the joist under the front window. 4 pauses, then 3. A space. 2. A space. 1. The pattern from that first Friday came back and then faded, like a signature finished by a steady hand. Lena whispered the name the sheriff had given them. She thanked the house for not keeping what did not belong to it. She said rest and meant it. Spring will come. The corn will return to green. The house will warm and the front door will swell and stick. There will be shoes left on the mat and coffee rings on the table and 2 mugs cooling on the windowsill when the late light comes in thin and bright. If you stand on Redfield Pike and look at the front window, you might see the blind string lift and lie down again. You might hear nothing and call that peace. Or you might hear a faint note, music without a mouth, and you might consider that a name learned in the dark is still a name, and that under every floor there is a map of the lives that taught the wood how to speak. The mystery that was buried beneath the floorboards remains a mystery in the way the earth holds its own counsel. A ring without a stone, a locket with a face that could be anyone who ever waited for a door to open. A vial that kept a ribbon of hair safe in oil, a ledger recording a boarder who liked to play a hymn when the mill ran too loud, a sheriff who walked a hall in a careful way, an archivist who knew dust could carry a story across a century without shedding a word, a contractor who understood that respect can look like new screws driven into old plank, 2 people who signed a deed without knowing that the house they bought had a heart that beat. They bought it anyway. They listened. They learned the rhythm under the room where they drank coffee and count the minutes between one day and the next. And when the knocks came again and then fell silent, they knew what it meant. A hand at last released its hold on the underside of the world. A name stood up and left the floor behind. The boards settled. The house exhaled. And the night finally felt like night. A discovery so strange, even police refused to explain. By the time the Friday night lights flickered off at Millfield High, the air had already turned glassy and cold. You could see your breath drift and vanish over the parking lot, slow and ghost-like, as people shuffled toward their cars. It was late October, a little past 10:40 p.m., and somewhere beyond the last row of houses, the black line of the woods rose like a wall. Locals called that stretch Blackwood Pines. Most cut a wide circle around it after dark. A few swore they heard things moving in there when the wind died. Not animals, not people, just movement. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? 2 students made the mistake of taking the trail anyway. They had done it before. A shortcut from the field to the duplexes along Wilson Street. They were laughing at first, jackets zipped to their chins, footsteps crunching through frost and leaves. One kept glancing at his phone, the screen lighting his face. The other was listening for owls. He said the silence felt wrong. No crickets, no distant highway, just their breathing and the whisper of pine needles. They saw the light at 10:52 p.m., according to the first frantic call to 911. It was not a flashlight, not a fire. The glow came from the ground itself, a low blue pulse that made the damp leaves look like glass. It flickered with a slow heartbeat, brightened, dimmed, and brightened again. They moved toward it because that is what people do when their minds are split between curiosity and fear. They step closer. They tell themselves one more step will explain everything. The clearing was not large, elliptical, almost a perfect oval, as if the trees had agreed to lean back. In the middle, the leaves were parted, and the dirt had a sickly sheen. Half buried in the soil sat a circle of metal 5 feet across. Smooth, pitted in places, wet even though the ground around it was dry. It was flush to the earth like a lid over something deeper. The blue glow leaked through hairline seams, as if the thing were breathing under the surface. When the taller student placed his hand a few inches above it, the back of his teeth hummed. They ran. They tripped. One of them dropped his phone and doubled back for it, fingers shaking so hard he kept missing the lock screen. When they finally cleared the tree line, they could see the stadium lights dying to black behind them and a few stragglers still in the lot. The call came in breathless and broken. The dispatcher on duty logged it at 10:58 p.m. and wrote the words, "Possible downed equipment and unknown hazard." She sent a car anyway. Deputy Holden was first on scene at 11:14 p.m. His cruiser idled on the shoulder, hazard lights ticking, as he stepped into the timber with a mag light and an old habit of talking to himself when he felt a shiver he could not explain. He found the trail. He found the crushed leaves. He found the clearing and the metallic circle at its center. He crouched. He did not touch it. The beam of his mag light dimmed and ghosted out. So did his radio for a few seconds, an empty hiss like wind in a bottle. He clicked the mic anyway and said he needed backup, voice low and steady. He said there was some kind of device. He said the ground was vibrating. By 11:32 p.m., there were 3 patrol cars along Wilson Street and another a few hundred yards north where an old logging road cut into the trees. The officers moved slowly, shoulders tight, hands hovering near holsters because something about the air felt charged. They fanned out and circled the clearing. They each saw it. They saw the glow. They heard the hum under their boots, a note not quite sound, not quite pressure. One of them swore he could feel the hum in his throat. A sergeant named Avery decided they would do nothing until the state was notified. He did not want anyone touching the thing. He asked a younger officer to plant a traffic cone at the edge of the clearing, just to mark the entry point. The cone slid a few inches the second it touched the ground and settled crooked. That was when the sergeant said, very calmly, that everyone should step back. They did. At 12:10 a.m., the noise changed. The glow thinned to a paler shade, almost white, then flared. The trees around the oval bled shadows in every direction. Pine needles lifted and lowered as if stirred by wind, but there was no wind. Something in the dirt flexed. The men backed away again, boots cracking sticks, breath frosting in frantic bursts. A dozen birds erupted from the black trees and shot up, spiraling in confusion. Then everything went still. There were other calls that night. A woman in a house 2 blocks from the tree line complained that her ceiling fan began spinning backward at midnight opposite the switch. A man on Parkview Avenue said every photo on his living room wall was tilted in the same direction by morning, as if the house had been nudged. The 911 dispatcher added those to the log because she did not know what else to do. At 1:47 a.m., a convoy of black SUVs rolled into Millfield and slid onto Wilson Street, like they had practiced the turn. Their headlights were low, their plates were meaningless. The men who climbed out wore jackets without patches and carried cases they did not label. They walked into the timber without asking the officers anything beyond where. They set up tower lights. They dragged a blue tarp across the ground, then rolled it back like a tongue. They unloaded a portable generator that coughed, caught, and thumped. The sound masked the smaller hum beneath their boots, but it didn't erase it. People at the windows in the houses across the street watched in their kitchen dark and would later pretend they had fallen asleep. By sunrise, the clearing was a scar. The blue glow was gone. The metallic circle was gone. There was a pit 6 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and filled back up with a different color of soil, as if someone had brought in a fresher kind from a town away. The men with the cases walked out as the light came up and the SUV doors shut in a crisp rhythm like a marching band. The officers, pale and quiet, were told to finish the perimeter and take down the tape by noon. When a local reporter asked if there had been a gas leak or a sinkhole, the sergeant said the investigation was ongoing and the area was safe. He did not look at the reporter while he said it. What happened next is the part people argue about, because it is the part nobody can prove. In the week that followed, whenever the wind died, you could feel something in your chest if you stood at the edge of the clearing. Just a pulse. Not a noise, exactly. A pressure wave in the sternum. Some blamed power lines, others blamed factories 2 towns over. One man swore it vibrated his molars. A retired teacher brought a compass and watched the needle drag itself in a slow circle like it was drunk. A kid with a drone tried to fly straight over the trees, and the drone flipped, steadied, then drifted sideways, fighting something you could not see. The kid said, the camera feed developed a white halo at the exact moment it passed over the clearing. He deleted the clip a day later because the battery started swelling on his desk. A hiker vanished the following Thursday. He was a line cook at the diner on Old County Road, quiet, known for walking a lot after his shift to clear his head. His route took him along a dirt path that paralleled the tree line for a mile, then curved away. He never came home. The search started before sunrise. It ended after midnight. Dogs circled the oval of the clearing and whined. They pawed at the ground and would not cross onto the disturbed soil. The only thing the searchers found was the line cook's knit cap sitting upright on a low stump, as if someone had placed it there for him to come back and get. There were no prints that made sense. The sheriff stopped the search when the fog moved down from the ridge, and the beams of flashlights just made white walls. The next morning, a CCTV camera 2 blocks away showed something strange. At 3:12 a.m., every streetlight on Wilson Street flushed brighter for 1 second, then dropped to a dimmer glow. The tape showed that surge like a breath across the entire frame. That was when people stopped talking to officers at the coffee counter. They spoke to each other instead, over fences, across aisles at the hardware store, in the whispery dark of the church vestibule after evening service. They listed the oddities like tally marks, the fridge magnets that slid toward the left corner of the door, the auto shop's analog clock that ran slow, then fast, then slow, always around the same time of night, student tablets that charged on the bus, but immediately drained when brought to the corner of the field nearest the timber. A man who tried to mow his lawn near the trailhead said the mower's engine stuttered every time the blade pointed toward the pines. He turned in a slow circle and listened to the stutter keep time, click, 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 like a metronome. Nobody wanted to be the first to say it out loud, but they all said it quietly, sooner or later. Whatever the men in the SUVs took that night, they didn't take all of it. Something was still there, something under the ground. 2 weeks after the first incident, a local radio host invited callers to share their stories, and the phone board lit up. A nurse described a patient who came in with steady vitals, then the monitor leaped as if a hand had pushed on the chest pad. A teacher said her classroom projector flickered whenever she cued videos after lunch, but not during morning announcements. A mail carrier described standing, frozen, at the exact edge where the trail met the road, feeling like the woods were pressing against the front of his shirt. He put 1 foot forward, and the feeling grew. He put his foot back, and it eased. He did that 4 times, like he was stepping into cold water and back out, and then he turned around and delivered the rest of his route on the opposite side of the street. The police chief held a short press conference that Friday at 4:00 p.m., 30 minutes before sundown. He read from a printed statement. He said state agencies had surveyed the area and found no environmental hazards. He said rumors were making people frightened, and frightened people misinterpret ordinary things. Someone asked whether there was any truth to the claim that the department had signed non-disclosure agreements. He folded the paper in half and said, "The town is safe." He said it twice. He did not take another question. On Sunday night, a group of neighbors decided to walk to the clearing as a kind of dare. There were 5 of them, all adults, all stone sober. They wore headlamps, thick jackets, and boots. They took a plastic bag in case they found any litter to prove their point when challenged online the next day. They reached the oval at 9:26 p.m. and switched their lamps to the lowest setting. The ground looked ordinary at first. Then their eyes adjusted. In the dirt were arcs, not drawn with a stick, but pressed by something heavy and curved. The arcs intersected and made almond shapes that overlapped like a chain of eyes. When one neighbor leaned to touch a shape, his headlamp fluttered and steadied. He said it felt like the dirt pulsed under his palm, a tiny upward push, then nothing. He swallowed hard and said he was done. They all were. At home that night, one of them found a thin layer of grit on the soles of his boots that glowed faintly when the bedroom was dark and the door was shut. Not bright, just enough to make him pull his foot back as if he had stepped on something. Breathing. He scrubbed the boots with dish soap until his hands cramped. The calls to the department did not stop, but the responses changed. Officers said they were reassigned. Others said they were told to pass anything about Blackwood Pines to a different number. The 911 dispatcher who took the first student call transferred to a desk job 2 towns over. She told a cousin she did not like the way the phone sounded after midnight. She said there was a buzz you could hear if you pressed the receiver just right to your ear, as if a deep note lived inside the line and waited for you to listen. A winter storm hit, and the ground froze. For a while, the stories thinned. People said the snow sealed the place up. People said whatever had been under there was sleeping. But when the thaw came, so did the smell. Not rot, not gas. A faint, metallic scent like wet batteries mixed with pine and river rock. It made the skin at the back of the neck tighten. A trail runner gagged the first time he caught it and cut his loop short. A mother walking a stroller stopped, turned around, and went home by a longer route, heartbeat in her throat. One late evening, just before full dark, a state geologist parked along Wilson Street and walked in alone with a handheld meter and a notepad. She was not escorted, she was not announced. She paused at the edge of the oval, adjusted the meter, and stayed very still. A man smoking on his porch watched the pale rectangle of her notepad move as she wrote. When she came out, he asked how it looked. She met his eyes for a second and said the soil was non-compliant with expectation. Then she climbed into her car and drove away without her headlights for the first 30 feet. Months passed. People tried to make the whole thing into a story that could be told in a single sitting. They could not. It sprawled. It ducked when you reached for it. It tangled itself up in small evidence, 1,000 strange details that refused to turn into a single clean answer. A barista used a new grinder after the old one began arcing a flick of blue inside the housing. A school bus driver avoided a stop for a week because the children all got nosebleeds when the bus idled facing the timber. A runner mapped her jog and saw the GPS track deviate 3 feet to the left, then 3 feet to the right, then swing back, an invisible river pushing and pulling her as she kept her pace. She had not felt it. Or maybe she had and called it wind. The diner on Old County Road put out a tip jar with a hand-lettered sign that read for answers. It filled faster than the one for coffee. People laughed at that, then did not laugh. You could sit in the corner booth with the nicked Formica and hear someone at the counter tell the same story they swore they would never repeat. Their voice would drop, and you could see their hands flatten on the surface, palms down, as if they were steadying themselves against something that might tilt the room. When the anniversary rolled around, the town did not mark it. There were no posts from the department, no statements from the chief, no official anything. But the sky over Millfield was clear that night, and the moon sat low like a coin, and just after 11:00 p.m. Three porch cameras along Wilson Street captured a thin sheet of fog sliding across the road from the woods to the houses without touching the ground. It flowed over the asphalt like oil. It climbed the curb without breaking. It reached the lawns and rolled back, retreating to the trees in one smooth motion. The cameras recorded that and then glitched for exactly 4 seconds each. In those 4 seconds, the timestamp stalled, then snapped ahead. People will tell you that what we found in those woods was a machine. Others will say it was a lid, and the real thing was beneath, and the men with the SUVs just took the lid. A few will tell you not to think of it as a thing at all. They will tell you to think of it as a place that does not belong where it is, a pocket of rules that don't match our rules, pressing up from underneath like a bubble caught under wallpaper. And if you stand in the right spot after midnight, they'll say you can feel the pattern it makes, the pulse that is not a sound, the pressure that is not a hand, the sense that something vast and patient has turned its attention toward you, not with eyes, but with the cold curiosity of a tide measuring a shoreline. Ask the police about it and watch what happens. Watch the way their faces go still, like a windless pond. Watch how their words slow down. They will say it was a utility issue. They will say the area is safe. They will say the rumors are making people nervous and that nervous people see things. They will not describe the way the ground lifted under their boots that first night, a fraction of an inch, enough to make every muscle lock. They will not tell you how their radios went dead in their hands and how the silence in their ears was loud enough to make them flinch. They will not admit that for one long breath it felt as if the clearing was breathing back, and that something beneath the soil pressed up, testing the weight of the world, and then withdrew. They do not say that part. They look past you and talk about weather and new tires for the cruisers and the fundraiser for the K9 unit. They change the subject. They ask how your family is. They call you by your first name and remind you to lock your car because there have been break-ins on the west side. But Millfield remembers, houses remember, the trees remember, the oval is still there, pale dirt in a shape the rain can't undo, and if you stand on Wilson Street on a still night and stare into the dark line where the pines begin, you will notice how your breath feels heavier when you exhale, like the air is listening to you. You will notice that your phone degrades to a single bar for no reason at all. You will notice that the hairs on your forearms lift, even under your jacket, even with your fists shoved deep into your pockets. And you will think about the boys who saw the light, the officer who knelt and felt the hum in his teeth, the men who came and took what they could and left what they could not carry. You will think about the cap on the stump and the boots that glowed faintly in a darkened room. You will think about fog that crawled like an animal and lights that surged like a heartbeat, and the small, private way a person's face changes when they admit, just to themselves, that they have met something that will never fit into words. A discovery so strange, even police refuse to explain it. And maybe that is the only honest thing anyone has said about Blackwood Pines. Not that it is dangerous, not that it is safe, only that it is there, under the dirt and the leaves and the thin shell of what we prefer to believe is solid ground. It is there, and it is patient, and it is listening. If you go, do not step into the oval. Do not talk loudly. Do not drop anything you are not willing to leave behind. Go home while the streetlights still feel like a promise, and shut your door and set your phone face down on the table if it starts to buzz. If the house hums back at you in a slow, steady rhythm, do not answer. Stand very still. Wait for it to pass. And when it does, when the air lightens and your breath comes easy again, tell yourself the same thing everyone here tells themselves in kitchens and living rooms and quiet cars at red lights. Tell yourself it is over. Tell yourself it will not come back. Tell yourself that whatever moved under that clearing went back to sleep. Then listen very carefully to the silence that follows. If you hear the smallest tremor under your feet, a whisper you feel more than hear, do not look toward the trees. Look at your hands. Watch how they shake. Count your fingers. Say your name out loud to keep the room steady. He should have never opened that door. It was late on a Friday night in a quiet town on the outskirts of Pennsylvania. The air felt heavy after a day of rain, and the road that curved past Ashwood Drive shone with a thin black gloss. Porch lights were dim, televisions glowed behind curtains, and a freight train in the distance called out with a low horn that rolled over the roofs like a warning. At the end of the street stood the old boarding house, a brick rectangle with a sagging porch and a doorbell that never worked. Inside that house, a man named Daniel tried to sleep, but sleep had been avoiding him for weeks, and the night had other plans. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Daniel rented a narrow room on the second floor, right above the front door. He worked at a warehouse near the river, sorting shipments that came in long after sunset. He was the quiet type, steady at a job that did not ask questions. He kept a small schedule on his wall, neat and orderly lines with times blocked out for work and meals and the odd call to his sister in Ohio. He did not drink, he did not go out, and he did not believe the stories the tenants traded in the stairwell. The ones about the basement, and the thing that moved in the old crawl space behind the laundry, and the door at the end of the second floor hall that never opened for anyone. At 11:43 p.m., while he was sorting a stack of bills under the glow of his small lamp, the radiator clicked and sighed, the rain ticked at the window, and from the hallway came 3 slow knocks. The sound was hollow and patient. It did not sound like someone calling on a neighbor. It sounded like a rhythm that had started long before he arrived and would continue long after he was gone. He waited. The knocks did not repeat, so he told himself it was the pipes, or the wood, or the wind that rattled the downspout. He stood anyway, as if a string had been tied around his ribs and tugged him toward the door. He opened his room and leaned into the hall. The overhead light's hum buzzed through a yellow haze. The carpet was thin and stained near the edges. At the far end, past the framed exit map and the dusty fire extinguisher, stood a door that matched none of the others. It was a touch taller, a touch narrower, as if it had been measured for another house and shoved into place here, a compromise in wood and paint. He knew the stories, that it was a storage closet, that it was a sealed stairwell, that it did not exist, and everyone else was bored or cruel or both. He also knew that when he first moved in, he counted the doors on both sides on his way to the far end, then counted the windows from the street, and the numbers did not agree. The landlady, Ms. Whitcomb, waved him off with a thin smile. "Old houses have tricks," she said. "Old carpenters make mistakes." He wanted to believe that, so he did, right up until 11:43 p.m. When someone, somewhere, knocked 3 times and asked to be heard. He walked toward it. The carpet gave a tired sigh under each step. When he got close, he smelled damp earth, like a garden shovel pulled from a hole. He touched the knob. It was cold, colder than any metal should be in a hallway with steam heat hissing from a register. He told himself not to turn it. He told himself to go back, lock his own door, and wait until morning. Then he heard a whisper that was hardly a sound at all. He stood very still. The air felt thinner. The lights flickered as if they were trying not to look. He told himself that words can be imagined, that one voice can be another voice in disguise. The whisper came again, almost kind, almost a hum, drawn out through teeth that did not belong to a face he could picture. He turned the knob. The latch slid back without resistance. The door opened an inch and stopped with a tired groan. A draft slid through the gap and brushed his face. It felt like the first breath from an old cellar, or the mouth of a tunnel that had not seen daylight in a very long time. He raised his lamp. The light reached into the opening and touched nothing. No wall, no shelves, no stored paint cans or broom. The darkness did not behave like a shadow. It looked like a place where light did not live. He shut the door. He locked it. He pressed his palm to the frame and felt a tremor pass through the wood, like something unseen had placed its hand there as well. He walked back down the hall and did not run. He closed his room, turned his own lock, and leaned back against the door with his eyes closed. His heart stuttered against his ribs. He told himself he did the right thing. He told himself that he had not actually opened it at all. Then he noticed the smell of damp soil in his room, and he noticed that the wind had stopped, but the curtains still moved. At 12:07 a.m., the knocks returned. Not at the end of the hall, right behind his head. 3 slow raps on his own door. He shouted that it was late, that he would call the police, that whomever it was had the wrong room. The knocks stopped. A soft scrape moved down the bottom edge of the door, like fingers feeling along for a seam. He stayed awake until 3:11 a.m., with the lamp on and the window cracked. He woke hours later with his cheek on the desk and light pushing around the shade, like a gentle threat. He almost convinced himself it was a dream until he saw the scrap of paper pinned under his mug. The paper looked ripped from a notebook. He had no notebook like it. 3 words had been written with a blunt pencil. "You let me." He lifted the note with 2 fingers and felt grit on the bottom, tiny grains that looked like sand from a riverbank. He set it down and felt the house breathe. He decided to go to work early. He turned and found the door to his room, not where he left it. He had left it on the wall that faced the hall. Now the wood stood 2 feet to the right, the door frame had moved with it, the paint edges were clean, the old screw holes that should have shown where the hinges lived were gone. For a long moment, he thought he had simply misjudged the distance. Then he stepped back and saw a pale rectangle of wallpaper that had been spared by some old dresser, and the rectangle no longer lined up with anything. He said his own name out loud, the way someone falling says a word to hear a human sound, and he left for work without breakfast. For a few days, he did not touch the far door. He did not walk to the end of the hall. He took the stairs in the back and left by the kitchen because the front porch swayed under a weight he could not see. He heard stories from the others. Nora, on the first floor, said something brushed her ankle while she folded laundry, and no one else was in the room. Jonah, in the smallest room under the attic, said his alarm clock rang at 2:13 a.m. Every night, even when he unplugged it, and one night when it rang, he felt something cold pass over his face, as if it was testing how he breathed. Ms. Whitcomb said the water bill had doubled and no one had taken longer showers. They said these things with the nervous humor of people who want to hear themselves deny what they fear. By the end of the week, the knocks came on the front door at odd hours. 3 deliberate raps and then silence. A delivery showed up with no return address, 1 box of nails, and a hammer that looked like it had been in a fire. The porch light went out and could not be coaxed back to life. When the postman came, he asked if they had started digging in the yard. He said he could smell wet clay when he dropped the mail, and someone had left a shovel leaning against the porch rail. No one owned a shovel like that. The blade had been ground so thin, it flashed like a mirror when the sun cleared the clouds. At 9:26 p.m. on a Monday, he came home to find the hallway colder than the outside air. He reached his room and saw that his lamp was on and his window had been raised, though he remembered very clearly lowering it before he left. He went in and froze. On his bed, placed on the folded blanket as carefully as a gift, lay an old brass key. The teeth were sharp, the bow worn smooth by long use. There was a tag tied to it with a bit of frayed cord. The tag had 2 words written by the same blunt pencil. "For you?" He held the key and felt a pressure in his ears, as if he had driven up a mountain without noticing. He knew without any logic that the key would fit the door at the end of the hall. He also knew that the door had not needed a key when he turned it a week ago. He set the key on the desk and told himself he would ignore it. At 10:01 p.m., his light dimmed, not like a line sagging on the grid, but like a hand placed over a mouth. The key slid across the desk with a soft metallic breath and fell into his palm. He went to the hall and walked to the far door before he could give himself a reason not to. He did not want a reason. He wanted the space between the knocks to end. He pressed the key into the lock. The metal welcomed it. He turned his wrist. The tumblers whispered. The door swung inward without sound. The dark inside pulled at the light in the hall. The bulb did not flicker this time. It simply failed, like an eye that refused to look. He held the door with a shaking hand. He raised his lamp and leaned forward. The air smelled like iron and moss. The floor beyond the threshold did not look level. It tilted down and away, not like a staircase, but like a slope, as if the door opened to a place that was beneath the house and also someplace else. He said hello, then winced at the sound of his own voice. The dark answered with a slow rasp. It sounded like breath pulled across brick. He shut the door and locked it with the key and hung the key on a nail above his bed, determined to prove that he was still the one who decided where things belonged. He did not sleep until dawn laid a smudge of gray across the ceiling. He dreamed with his eyes open and saw a field of doors set into the ground like gravestones. In the dream, he walked between them and counted. He could not finish. The field did not end. The next day, he told himself he would leave. He packed a bag with shirts and socks and the metal photo frame of his parents on a motel patio near Lake Erie. He called his friend Victor, who worked nights as a guard at the warehouse, and asked if he could crash on his couch for a few days. Victor said yes, though he sounded worried by the request, and he told Daniel to arrive after midnight when his shift ended. At 7:15 p.m., Daniel turned his lock, shouldered his bag, and stepped into the hall. He saw fresh footprints on the thin carpet, bare footprints, long and wet, moving away from his door and toward the far end. There were no return prints. At the far door, the footprints faded and stopped. The handle was wet. There was no water anywhere else. He left by the back stairs. The alley behind the house held 2 trash cans and the ghost of a vegetable garden that had never taken. The sky threatened more rain. He cut across 2 blocks toward the bus stop. As he walked, he passed a storefront with a narrow display of lamps and secondhand dishes, and in the glass he saw the reflection of the back of his head. Behind his reflection, though, behind the glass, in the store that should have been locked and dark, he saw a door with a tall, thin frame. It stood where no door should be. It stood the way a finger points in reprimand. He did not turn to look. He kept walking and kept his eyes on the gutter where rain gathered and slithered. He took the late bus. He tried to read. The lights in the bus hummed and dipped. A man, 2 seats back, muttered that everyone should sit down and be quiet, even though everyone was already sitting and no one was talking. Daniel got off near the river where the warehouse stood like a row of gray teeth. He waited for Victor by the back entrance under a buzzing yellow light. At 12:02 a.m., the side door opened and Victor waved him in with a quiet nod. They walked past cages stacked with boxes and the whine of a forklift that was bored with its job. Victor asked if he was all right. Daniel said the house felt wrong and he needed a few days away. Victor said he could stay as long as he wanted, that his couch had a good view of a boring wall, and sometimes a boring view could heal things that moved too fast. They reached the small security office. Daniel set his bag down and leaned against the metal desk. Then he heard it again. 3 slow knocks. Not on the warehouse door, not on a wall. From behind the metal cabinet in the office where no door could hide, Victor heard it too. He narrowed his eyes and walked to the cabinet. The sound came again. 3 knocks that rolled down the metal like water. Victor put a hand on the cabinet and yanked it away from the wall. Behind it was nothing but cinder block, cold gray squares, and mortar like dry bones. Victor swore and shoved the cabinet back. He stood still for a long moment, the way a dog stands when it hears something you cannot. Then the office light blinked and came back, and he looked at Daniel and did not smile. They left together at 2:04 a.m. and walked to the parking lot. The river moved like heavy glass. A fog bank drifted near the pilings. Victor drove while Daniel watched the rearview mirror. Streetlights passed in even intervals. On the 3rd light, Daniel realized that each time the car rolled under the glow, he saw a tall black rectangle standing in the reflection, as if a door had been placed behind the back seat and bent the mirror as it passed. He did not look back. He watched the mirror and kept his hands flat on his thighs. Victor lived in a basement apartment under a dentist office on Maple Street. The walk down the short set of steps felt like a dive. The air smelled like coffee grounds and old magazines. The couch faced a small television and a shelf of paperbacks. Daniel sat and tried to slow his breathing. At 3:11 a.m., The sound came from the hallway outside, the simple and terrible shape of 3 knocks, and Victor went to the door with a baseball bat and flung it open. The hallway was empty. A draft slipped over his shoes and ran past Daniel on the couch as if something had been waiting to be invited. Victor shut the door and slid the chain and stood with his mouth open, then walked to the couch and put the bat down and said they would get a priest or a contractor in the morning, he did not care which. Morning did not help. The day stood gray and slack. Victor called a cousin who knew a handyman, who knew a carpenter, who had a story about a walled-up passage in a row house in Reading. The carpenter came at 2 p.m. with a belt of tools and a calm face. He listened while Daniel said what he could. He nodded the way people nod when they decide to accept things. They can move toward the part where they fix it. He went to the old boarding house with them. He stood at the end of the second-floor hall and looked at the tall, thin door that waited without impatience. He took a small square of mirror from his pocket and held it in the opening when Daniel turned the key and moved the door a few inches. The carpenter watched the mirror with a still face. The mirror did not show darkness. The mirror did not show anything. It did not show the hall behind them. It stayed blank. He closed the mirror and said that sometimes there are doors that are not doors, sometimes there are holes that were not dug, and sometimes a house is built over something that does not agree. He ran his palm down the frame and felt where the wood had been sanded, then scarred, then sanded again. He said there was an old story in towns like this about a set of steps with 11 risers and a 12th riser made of empty space. People would count and be satisfied, then put a foot down and fall where there was no step. He said there were also stories about men who bricked up their sins and slept sound after, until one night the mortar breathed. He set his bag down and took out a pouch of salt and a small mason line and a chalk plum. He had learned the habit from a mason who drank black coffee at dawn and swore that chalk lines remember the world the way it should be. He hung the plum by the frame. The string shook. The weight turned slow circles and would not settle. He asked for a hammer. Daniel brought the burned one from the porch, untouched since the delivery. The carpenter frowned at the black marks on the handle and did not use it. He used his own. He set 3 screws into the frame and 3 into the door and tied them to the line. He ran salt along the threshold until it looked like surf. He told Daniel to leave the door closed, locked, and tied, and to keep a light burning through the night so he could see if the line broke. He said he would return in the morning with a proper plate and a brace. He said to call if the salt moved. He stepped back and looked weary suddenly, like the room had taken a small bite of him, and he left with a quiet nod. At 2:09 a.m., Daniel woke to a soft hiss. He sat up and saw the salt rolling back from the threshold as if an invisible tide was pulling it inward. The string shook. The screws sang, a tiny metal whine like a sound a child could hear when a television is on. He stood and held the key and did not know what to do. The string snapped with 3 sharp tings. The screws turned. The door eased open, not toward him, but toward the dark that hungrily accepted it. He might have turned and run. He did not. He pressed the door closed with both hands and braced his feet and felt something on the other side pushing back with a slow, patient strength. He said, "Please stop." He did not even know to whom he spoke. The pressure eased. He turned the key. He leaned his forehead against the paint and stayed there until light began to creep around the window shade like a spy. He called the carpenter at 7:04 a.m. The call rang and rang. He left a message and waited. He called again, no answer. At noon, he walked to the corner store to buy coffee and bread and found a small crowd gathered by the alley. A police cruiser sat with its lights quiet but its engine running. 2 officers stood near a man on the ground with a sheet over his chest. The sheet was bright white against his boots that stuck out one end. A neighbor said the man had been found at dawn, stretched out near the dumpster, with a look like a person who left a task unfinished. Daniel felt the world narrow. He asked a woman in a scarf if she knew who it was. She said the man had a belt of tools on the curb. A leather pouch lay beside it with salt in the seams. A plumb bob sat under the bumper of a dirty sedan. Daniel said he needed air and he walked until he could not see the alley anymore. He did not return to the boarding house until evening. The door at the end of the hall waited. His own door stood where it should be now, as if the house had grown tired of the joke. He tried to pack again. He put the key in his pocket and told himself he would toss it into the river on the walk to the bus. As he zipped his bag, the room breathed cold. The window lowered by itself an inch and shut with a soft kiss. The lamp dimmed and brightened and dimmed again. He heard the knock. 3 steady raps, not from the hall, not from his door, but from inside his closet. He opened it with a small sound in his throat that could have been a laugh. The closet smelled like cedar and mothballs. An old coat that belonged to a tenant who never came back brushed his arm. The back of the closet did not hold a wall anymore. It held a tall, thin door, the same shape, the same handle. His head swam. He closed the closet and leaned his back against it and said the words he had read on the note. "You let me." He left that night at 10:27 p.m. He did not turn off the lamp. He did not lock his room. He went down the front steps where the porch sagged and turned left. The street looked longer than it ever had. He reached the corner and stopped. A man stood beneath the big sycamore that tilted over the curb. The man wore a coat that hung like a curtain. He faced away. He lifted a hand without moving his shoulder and knocked gently on the air in front of him. 1, 2, 3. The sound traveled to Daniel as if it had been made on wood near his ear. The man lowered his hand and walked across the street without looking left or right. He moved like a sleepwalker. Daniel took a step back. He went the other direction toward the church where the lights were always on for a little while after the hour. He did not pray. He sat in the last pew and watched the red exit sign burn like a coal and listened to the building creak as if it also had a spine and a set of tired ribs. The next morning, a city inspector arrived after a call that came from no one they could later identify. He wore a jacket with a seal and carried a clipboard with forms attached by a rusty clip. He walked through the house and looked at wiring and pipes and the water heater that rattled when it started. He reached the second floor. He paused at the end of the hall. He looked at the tall, narrow door as if reading a note in a language he almost remembered. He tried the handle. It did not turn. He wrote something on his form and left. On the way out, he told Ms. Whitcomb that old houses collect strange corners, and sometimes those corners collect a smell, and sometimes the smell is not a real smell but a memory of one. She nodded and smiled with her lips only. When he had gone, she climbed the stairs with a hammer and nails and a square of plywood. She stood at the door and waited. She did not raise the hammer. She walked back to her office and called a number she kept in a small book. No one answered that number either. The days after that did not break into clear pieces. Time smudged. He slept in fits. He saw the key in places he did not leave it. On his pillow, in the sink, inside his shoe like a small tongue. He took it to the river and threw it hard. It struck the water with a plunk that felt too small for the weight it carried. He watched the ripple widen and then close like a wound. He walked home and found the key sitting on his desk with the cord tied into a neat bow, as if someone with patient fingers had waited years to learn such a simple knot. Victor stopped by at 8:31 p.m. with 2 coffees and a man from his church who read quietly from a small book and asked to walk through the house with them. The man did not announce anything. He did not demand or command. He listened. He stood in the hall at the far door and said the place felt like a mouth pressed shut. He walked to the basement. The basement had a low ceiling and a strip of dirt floor near the far wall, where an old support post sank like a stake. The man crouched and touched the dirt and rose with a look of distant thought. He said he did not think the house was haunted in the simple way people like to say. He thought the house had been built over a path, like a country lane that had once run from one field to another. The lane did not end when the field was plowed. It kept going under what came after. He said some paths want travelers, some doors want to be used. He said someone long ago had opened a door here and did not shut it correctly. He said someone had tried to build a wall where a door did not want to be. He said none of this was about belief. It was about the shape of a wound and the way it will not close if a piece of it is missing. He asked Daniel what he had heard first. A knock, Daniel said. 3 knocks. The man nodded. He said 3 knocks are polite, they are the old way. They mean a traveler is asking permission. He said the worst thing you can do is open the door when the traveler has asked, and you do not know who it is. If you open, you become a host. If you refuse, the traveler goes on. He looked at Daniel with eyes that had watched factory smoke for years and said that sometimes the host does not know he has become one until the first guest is already in the kitchen. That night, Daniel tried to follow orders. He placed the key in a bowl of salt. He drew a line of chalk across the threshold of his room and across the far door. He set a chair under the knob. He sat and waited. At 1:03 a.m., the chair slid quietly aside and settled a foot away, as if a careful hand had pushed it and did not want to scratch the floor. The chalk line broke without footsteps crossing it. The key rose an inch in the bowl and rested again as if nodding. The door in the hall did not move. The closet door inside his room did. He heard a breath, slow and deliberate, in a space that could not hold anyone. The breath did not rush. It took its time. It sounded like a tide that had finally decided which way it meant to go. He left a recording on his phone for whoever might come next. He spoke into the small microphone with his voice pulled tight. He said he was sorry for whatever he had done, even if all he had done was turn the knob of a door in a hallway that should have been boring. He said he did not believe in curses. He said he believed in mistakes. He said he felt like a man who had signed a contract written in invisible ink. He left the phone on the desk with the recording playing, on repeat, like a small litany. In the morning, the landlady knocked on his room and called his name. He did not answer. She opened the door and stepped in and felt a chill ripple her skirt. The lamp was on, the bed was unmade. The phone on the desk whispered the last line of his recording over and over in a thin loop. I did not mean to let you in. The closet stood open 2 inches. The far door at the end of the hall stood open a foot. A line of damp soil ran from the far door to the closet and stopped dead at the sill. The bowl of salt sat empty with a faint ring near its lip, as if something with many small hands had taken its measure. The police came and did what police do. They cataloged, they measured, they took photographs that flattened the room into rectangles and squares. Officer Nolan walked down to the basement and stared at the strip of dirt and came back up and wrote that the ground smelled like a place beside a river after a flood. He stood by the far door and looked into the dark that did not show the hall reflected in his pupils, and he decided to step away. The report said missing person. The report said no sign of forced entry. The report said the tenant had been under stress. The report did not say that Nolan woke that night at 3:11 a.m. in his own home to the sound of 3 polite knocks that came from inside the linen closet, and he lay still until the knocks moved on like a traveling show. Weeks passed without weeks passing at all. A new tenant toured the building and said he liked old wood and cheap rent. He took Daniel's room. He lasted 3 nights. He left a note under the rent box that said sorry and 2 jackknives on the table as if the color of their handles had been a promise he wanted to keep. A woman who taught at the middle school moved into Nora's old space and smiled at the stairwell like an actress who believes in second chances. She told a colleague that the house hummed like a distant generator even when the power was steady. She told no one that her alarm shifted to 2:13 a.m. and stayed there no matter how she set it. She left during a rain on a Tuesday afternoon with a single backpack and a plant under her arm that shook as if a breeze was in the hall, but there was no breeze in the hall. The landlady started to sleep on a cot in the office downstairs because the phones rang without calls, and she decided she would rather be the first to hear than the last. She opened the ledger and ran a finger down the old page where the house deeds were copied out for no good reason except that someone had liked the look of handwriting. She found an entry about a previous owner who had poured concrete in the crawl space and then broken it up with a sledge when the water would not run right. She found another entry about a boarder who spoke to the wall in the laundry room and said the wall spoke back with a voice like a voice in a metal pipe. She closed the ledger and told herself stories about plumbing and air and a bad memory that walks in circles. At dawn, she raised the blinds and found a small brass key on the windowsill with a tag that said, For you. She went very still and did not touch it until noon when she put on a pair of gloves and used 2 fingers to flick it into the trash. She took the trash out to the can and set the lid and walked inside and locked the back door. When she returned to the office, the key sat on the desk with the cord in a new bow that no one had tied. On a night with a clear sky and a slow moon, a group of teenagers dared one another to throw pebbles at the boarding house and run. They stood under the sycamore and whispered the way teenagers do. They were not cruel. They only wanted to feel their hearts rise. They crept along the fence and raised their arms, and at that exact moment, a soft knocking sound came from the fence itself. 3 polite raps that carried the texture of wood, though the fence was iron. They broke and ran. All but one who stood with his mouth open like a fish, because at the end of the second-floor hall, a door was open, and in the dark behind it, a figure stood. The figure looked tall, but also wrong, as if the lines of the body had been drawn with a rule that did not match the human sketch. The figure raised a hand, the knock came again. The boy ran so fast, he left his shoes. A year did not pass, because we will not count years. The house gathered dust in the places no one cleaned. The porch leaned a little more. The door at the end of the second-floor hall sometimes stood ajar for no one, and sometimes closed itself with a courtesy that felt like a joke. When a storm rolled up the valley, the house held its breath, and the lights in the kitchen flickered and stilled, and for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator showed its true note, and you could hear the shape of something that had been here longer than wires or motors or rain. Detective Reed, who was older than his haircut and younger than his eyes, stopped by every few months to ask if anyone had heard from the missing tenant. He stood at the foot of the stairs and looked like a man waiting for a train that would never come to this platform. He took notes that he did not keep. He asked the same questions. He did not ask about doors. One day, he sat alone in his sedan outside the house and watched the second-floor windows for an hour. At 3:11 p.m., when the street was quiet and a dog barked twice and then thought better of it, he saw a shape slide past the far window and pause. The shape did not move like a shadow made by a person. It moved like the afterimage in your eye when you stare at a light and then look away. He started the engine and drove to the municipal lot and sat with his head in his hands until the sensation passed that a set of steps was missing beneath his feet and he would fall if he tried to stand. There are people who believe they are too practical to be lost. They do not understand that a path that runs under a house has no use for belief. The door at the end of the hall is still there. Most days it is only wood and paint, holding the quiet air of a staircase that does not exist. Some nights it is not only wood. On those nights, the hallway feels longer than it did at noon. The bulb burns with a halo. The carpet nap looks pressed in the shape of feet that stood and waited. When you stand there, if you are foolish enough to stand there, you will feel the air lean toward you. It will feel like the moment a stranger steps too close on a bus. Polite and invasive at the same time. You will hear nothing at first. Then you will hear 3 knocks. Then you will hear a voice that speaks like a man who will not raise his voice because he does not need to. People who live far away will say that doors do not work that way. They will say a story is a way for a house to make sense of its creaks. They will say a man named Daniel had a bad week and made a bad choice and then made another. They will be right and wrong in equal measure. What is true is this: he should have never opened that door. He did anyway. He did a simple thing, and the world made of wood and light and time turned a few quiet degrees. We do not always see the turn. We feel it. We wake at 2:13 a.m. because an old clock in an old place has decided that is the right time for a soft hand to try a knob. We hear 3 knocks that are polite because the old ways are more patient than we are. We tell ourselves to ignore them. We do. We do not. We stand up and walk to the hall and place our fingers on a piece of metal that is colder than it should be, and we turn and we learn that some doors do not open into rooms, they open into unfinished invitations. On certain quiet mornings, the landlady pauses at the mailboxes and believes she hears someone at the end of the hall speaking very softly. She thinks she hears a man apologizing. She thinks she hears him say he did not mean to be a host. She stands very still and swallows, and the sound goes away. She does not tell anyone. She checks the keys on the hook. There is one more key than there should be. She does not touch it. She turns the sign on the front door to no vacancy, even when she has 2 rooms free. She tells herself it is for safety. She tells herself that boarding houses work best when they are a little empty. She tells herself that one day she will take a hammer to that far door and break it into a pile of obedient boards. She tells herself many things. At 11:43 p.m., on nights when the rain moves sideways, she hears 3 slow knocks and looks up from her chair. And for a second, one small second that stretches, she thinks she will answer. If you visit Ashwood Drive and you stand under the sycamore and you look at the second-floor window at the end of the hall, you might see nothing but the tired curtains sagging inward as if the house is swallowing. Or you might see a thin line darker than the rest, the seam of a door that is not quite shut. You might hear a knock, even if there is no wood within reach. You will be tempted to knock back. People are tempted by small rituals. Do not do it. Walk away while you can, walk to the corner, and do not look at your reflection in the storefront glass. If you do, you may notice a tall black rectangle standing where no door should be, and you may learn the trick too late. The trick is not that the door follows you. The trick is that once you have opened it, there is no place left where it is not. The house stands and waits. The train still calls with its low horn. The porch light still fails and returns when it wants. People still move in and out with boxes and hope. They tell one another that every town has a story like this. They say the names wrong and get the times mixed up. None of that matters. The rhythm is what matters. 3 slow knocks, a pause, 3 more. The whisper that sounds like breath pulled across brick. The cold metal of a knob at the end of a short walk that can take the rest of your life. The way a man speaks at the edge of a choice and thinks he has time to think. The way a door waits forever and never gets tired. He should have never opened that door. He did. And now, on certain nights, when the air is wet and the street is quiet and the hum of the wires makes your teeth buzz, you can stand very still and you will feel it. The world has a seam in it. Someone is on the other side of that seam with their knuckles raised, and they are polite, and they are patient, and they are calling on anyone who still believes a door is only wood. Why this tape was locked away for decades is. It began with a quiet knock on a metal door just after midnight, the kind of soft, embarrassed tapping that makes a night shift officer glance up and wonder if they imagined it. The archives room at the Mill County Sheriff's Office sat at the end of a dim corridor where the vending machines hummed and the fluorescent lights buzzed like tired cicadas. Deputy Mark Doyle had the key. He'd been told to keep the door closed unless someone from records was with him, but that night, a dispatcher slid him a note that said, a homeowner on Buckhorn Road had found an old VHS tape in a box of junk taken from an estate sale. The homeowner said there were voices on it. He said the tape knew his name. Before we begin, tell me where are you listening from and what time is it there? Doyle wasn't the superstitious type. He took the cardboard shoebox from the man who waited on the bench outside the bullpen, a guy who kept wringing his baseball cap and glancing toward the empty hallway like something might step into view at any second. The address on the receipt tucked in the box matched the old Hanley property out by Pine Hollow, a farmhouse everyone in the county knew for one reason or another. Teenagers dared each other to shine headlights at its hollow windows at night. Hunters used the overgrown pasture as a landmark. Years ago, a missing person search had used that house as a staging area for one long, cold week. Snow fell, search dogs whined. Nothing was resolved. Doyle carried the box into archives, flipped the light, and breathed in that dry, papery air that always smelled like stapled reports and lost time. Steel shelves marched in rows. A portable television on a wheeled cart sat in a corner beside a VCR the department kept for old evidence. He could have logged the tape and gone home. He could have sealed it, labeled it, done everything exactly by the book. Instead, the quiet got to him. The knowledge that he could dismiss a frightened man's worry with a simple, ordinary glance at ordinary static tempted him like a dare whispered in a crowded bar. He lifted the tape from the box. The plastic felt heavier than it should have, cool as if it had come from a refrigerator. Along the edge, someone had written in block letters with a thick marker, "Do not watch." Doyle smiled despite himself, that crooked grin people wear when they plan to disobey a childlike warning. He slid the cassette into the VCR, turned on the TV, and waited for snow to fill the screen, for dead air to hiss, for nothing to happen so he could shrug and clock out. The picture rolled once, twice, then steadied. A murky grayscale image formed, bleary at first, then startlingly clear. The frame showed a living room with a low ceiling and narrow windows. Lace curtains, a braided rug, a cabinet with a radio the size of a suitcase, a calendar tacked to the wall by the kitchen door, the page flipped to a month. Doyle couldn't make out because of glare from a lamp. It looked like the past, not just in the decor, but in the way the air itself seemed thick, as if the room were underwater. The timestamp in the corner was broken into nonsense, the digits dissolving and reforming like frost. No one spoke. No one walked through the frame. For a long minute, the camera just looked. Doyle leaned closer. The lens seemed to be placed at chest height near a doorway, angled slightly down, not on a tripod exactly, but on something stable. The room felt intact, clean, lived in, not abandoned. Then a sound rose, faint as breath on glass. It was not words, not yet, more like a murmur between floorboards. Doyle frowned and reached for the volume knob with a slow hand, as if a loud movement might startle whatever he was hearing. When the voices resolved, they didn't feel like actors captured on tape. They felt like people very near the microphone, speaking in low, urgent tones to a child. A man said, "Hush." A woman said, "Look at me." The child replied with a small, broken no, not like defiance, but like a plea. The camera did not turn. It stared at the empty room, and somewhere just out of frame, someone began to cry quietly. Not the chest-shaking sobs of panic, but the restrained, frightened weeping of someone trying not to be heard. Doyle's mouth went dry. He checked the box for a note, for a label, for anything that might explain what the homeowner had really brought him. He found nothing but a receipt with the estate sale address and a second piece of paper folded twice that smelled faintly, unbelievably, like storm-damp earth. On that paper, written in a narrower hand, were 4 words. "If you value sleep." The picture fluttered. The camera wasn't moving, but something in the light shifted like the room had inhaled. Doyle touched the screen with his fingertips and felt static buzz against his skin. The lens appeared to change focus without any mechanical sound, as if it were choosing where to look. At the edge of the braided rug, a small shadow lengthened, the sort of soft, feathered shape you'd expect from a lamp, only the lamp's shadow should have leaned away from the lamp. This one drew toward it, like something beyond the frame was changing the angle of light in a way that made no physical sense. Doyle murmured an involuntary, "Hey," and stepped back. Another voice came from off-camera, older, brittle, words like dried leaves. "You can't make it let go," it said. "Not now, not after this long." The child's small voice said something that the microphone didn't catch, and the older voice replied, "It will learn you. It always learns you." On instinct, Doyle reached for the remote. He wanted to stop it, not because of what he saw, but because of what his body felt, a faint vibration in the floor that could have been his own pulse until he realized it was syncing with the soft thump coming from the television. He hit pause. The image froze on a mid-tone gray frame. The thump continued, steady, spaced like footsteps on stairs. He ejected the tape with a shaky forefinger and pinched the cassette between the pads of his fingers as if it might sting him. He wrote an evidence label in block letters, sealed the tape in a bag, and carried it to a shelf at the very back where old burglary photos and mold-smelling diaries sat without attention. He locked the cage and told himself he'd call records in the morning, he'd call the homeowner, he'd pass this on like any other odd but harmless item. Then he turned off the lights and stood in the doorway longer than he meant to, listening with a sort of childish dread for the sound of the television clicking on by itself. It stayed dark. He laughed under his breath, a thin, embarrassed sound, and went home in the gray hour before dawn. He did not sleep. The tape might have gathered dust there if not for a flood in the basement 2 weeks later that forced the department to move stacks of files into the hallway. While shifting boxes, an archivist with a neat desk and a quiet manner named Lena Cotton saw the words on the label and felt a ripple of something she couldn't name. She had grown up near Pine Hollow. She remembered the search parties that trudged through the fields with fluorescent vests and hand warmers tucked in their gloves. She also remembered, more faintly, that her grandmother used to stop speaking when the Hanley property was mentioned, as if the house itself could overhear you. Lena did not believe in curses. She believed in chain of custody forms, in signatures that didn't smudge, in lists that balanced. Yet that night, with the basement pump whining and the fluorescent lights flickering just enough to look like blinking eyes, she rolled the VCR cart into a conference room and shut the door. She told herself she was previewing the tape so she could write an accurate synopsis for the catalog. She told herself she was saving time, saving money, saving the department another headache. She set the tape in the machine, sat on a folding chair with the back pressed to the wall, and let the screen fill a square of the dark with a light that never felt warm. This time, the picture began in the hallway of a house, the camera aimed at a narrow staircase. The steps were steep, the banister worn smooth at the places where hands had polished it through habit. The carpet runner had a faded floral pattern. Lena recognized a pattern like that from her grandmother's place, the kind of rug older relatives never threw away, no matter how frayed it became at the edges. The audio was clearer now. You could hear a radio murmuring something distant, not words, but the rise and fall of a human voice. Then the footsteps started again, that soft, measured thump. They were not coming down the stairs. They were ascending, slow, patient, pausing on every third step, like whoever was climbing had to listen before they took the next one. Lena felt it then. The slightest tremor against the soles of her shoes, as if the building itself were acknowledging the sound. She paused the tape, pushed the chair back, and stood up too quickly. The room swam. When she hit play again, the camera angle had shifted. It now looked into a small bedroom at the top of the stairs. A bedspread with a quilted ring pattern covered the mattress. A glass of water sat on a nightstand beside a neatly stacked paperback and a cloth-bound journal with an elastic band. She saw a hand near the glass, not reaching for it, but resting beside it. For a terrible second, she thought the hand was severed, alone on the table. Then she recognized the slow flex of fingers at rest. Someone sat on the edge of the bed, just out of frame. The voice of the older person returned. That brittle whisper. "Don't face it," they said. "You feed it every time you do." The child said, "What if it says my name?" The older voice waited a heartbeat, then said, "It will. It always does. You say this instead," and the sentence that followed was swallowed by a burst of static that sounded like a storm sucked through a straw. Lena's phone buzzed on the table, a small mechanical rattle that felt obscene in that room of slow dread. She let it go to voicemail, not because she wanted to keep watching, but because she felt if she cut the thread the tape had thrown into the room, something else would tug the loose end through. The camera did not move, yet the focus looked past the bedroom door into the hallway, as if the lens had decided the important thing was not the bed or the hand, but the dark mouth of the stairwell where the air looked thicker than air should. The screen cut out. The time counter on the VCR rolled forward soundlessly for several more seconds. Then an entirely new scene appeared, one that made Lena make a noise she had not made since she was a child alone in the upstairs bathroom at night. The new frame showed a different living room, one with drop ceiling tiles and a cheap shelf of binders and a corkboard with pinned memos. It took her a heartbeat to recognize that it was the very conference room she was sitting in, the camera positioned exactly where the television was now. The angle caught the folding chairs, the coffee stain near the wall, and the metal door with the scratch across it shaped like a crooked smile. The television in the frame was dark, but its screen held a smear of light in which a person could be seen faintly, as if reflected in a rain-blurred window. Lena did not want to lean closer, but she did. The person in the reflection was seated at a table. Their posture was unmistakably her own. A hand came up in the reflection and touched the side of the face. Her fingertips on her own cheek felt cool. Then the door in the granular image opened a fraction, and a shadow crossed the threshold in a way that made her stomach drop because it did not move like a person. It moved like a tilt in the frame, as if the picture had been lifted and whatever was outside had slid toward the low edge. The screen went black, the VCR clicked, and the tape stopped. Lena found that her throat hurt. She realized she had been holding her breath long enough to make her lungs ache. She waited for the childish instinct to pass, the one that told her to lift her feet onto the chair like something might be patient and low to the ground. Instead, she stood up, pulled the tape free, sealed it, labeled it again for good measure, and carried it to the furthest edge of the evidence room where she placed it, without ceremony, behind a ledger of vehicle thefts no one consulted anymore. On the outside of the cassette box, she added one more line beneath "Do Not Watch." She wrote, "Return to Hanley box." The next small thing that shouldn't have mattered but did was a maintenance call from the property owner who'd purchased the Hanley land when the farmhouse was finally condemned and knocked down. He wanted to build a storage garage and complained the foundation behaved like a sponge. Workers poured gravel and watched it settle overnight, as if the ground had exhaled. On the second morning, one of the crew placed his thermos on a stack of lumber, stepped away, and when he returned, the thermos lay on its side with a neat wet circle beneath it, water inching toward the old footprint of the staircase. He swore he heard a radio far away, a voice he couldn't make out, speaking steadily like someone reading a forecast to a room that had no window. Word spread the way it does in small places where everybody knows everybody, not through official channels, but through murmured confessions at the end of shifts. A dispatcher named Brooks admitted he heard his own name whispered from the archive's cage when he passed it on a night he knew no one was inside. A EMT said the television in the break room flickered to a local news channel that hadn't existed in years and ran a crawl with his street spelled wrong. A substitute teacher told a friend she saw a shape in the reflection of the gym office door during a lockdown drill. Not a person exactly, but a bend in the light that felt like looking down old stairs. A journalist living 2 towns over, Mallory Keene, heard the rumors when she stopped for coffee, and a man in a dusty jacket told her, with a seriousness that made her set down her cup, that there was a tape at the sheriff's office that kept finding new rooms to show. She did not laugh. She was the sort who never laughed when someone told a story that made them scared. She filed a records request for anything relating to the Hanley property, to Buckhorn Road, to a VHS cassette turned in by a resident whose name she'd been given on a napkin stained with cream. The department responded with a polite denial that said no such item could be located. She filed again, narrower, and received a similar answer that used slightly different phrasing as if an actual person had decided to make the refusal sound less like a form. Mallory did not give up. She visited the Hanley lot on a cloudy afternoon when the air smelled like rain and distant train brakes. The pad of the old foundation lay like a dull gray tooth against the weeds. A few stacked pallets leaned against a roll-up door on a new storage unit the owner was adding. She walked the perimeter slowly, counting her steps, listening. When she reached the place where a broken corner of concrete dipped into loam, her phone vibrated with a call from a number she didn't know. She answered without speaking first. A woman's voice said hello in that breathless, considerate tone people use when they are in a library or a church. Then the voice said, "Don't face it," and the connection filled with a rushing that did not sound like interference so much as wind in a narrow stairwell. Mallory said, "Who is this?" And the line went dead. Her call log recorded the number, but when she dialed it back, 3 hollow beeps told her it did not exist. She wrote the story anyway, She wrote it as a feature about the persistence of place, about the way a town layers its fears like paint over old wallpaper. She did not name the tape because she could not prove it. She did not accuse the department because she had no interest in being uninvited to the meetings where people say the things that matter when the recorder is off. She printed it in the Sunday edition with a photograph of her own hand closing around a fragment of blue and white ceramic she found near a place the old kitchen would have been, a piece of a plate, a vague pattern of flowers that had outlived the table where someone once set it down after drying the dish with a towel that smelled of sunshine. That would have been the end, a story people folded into their morning and forgot by lunch, if not for a thing that followed. 2 days after the story ran, a padded envelope arrived at the paper addressed to Mallory. Inside was a tape, no label, no return address, only a note on notebook paper torn from the center of a spiral. It read, "Not the same one, but you'll see." Her stomach let go a little. She set the tape on her desk, watched the sun strike its plastic edge, and told herself it was a prank as her skin tried to make her stand up and leave the building without her bag. She borrowed a VCR from the library, set it up in the paper's small conference room, and pressed play. The screen opened on a frame so ordinary that for half a minute her chest loosened with relief. It was a living room in a rental house, beige carpet, white walls, television against a wall, sofa with the kind of cushions that always look one day too old. Her reporter's brain started to inventory details she could track. A magnet from a diner in Cleveland on the fridge in a doorless kitchen, a floppy-eared dog bed with no dog in it, a blue rain jacket slung over a chair. Then she stopped taking notes because the camera angle was wrong in a way that made her palms sweat. The view came from a place slightly above the television, but too close to be an obvious shelf. It had that same chest-height perspective as the other tape, and there was no warble in the image a handheld camera would produce. The audio at first was nothing, and then faint, as if sound were arriving down a long hallway. A clock ticked. A floorboard gave a single, complaining groan as wood settled. Then, very softly, someone in another room said hello with that same considerate hush she had heard on the phone at the Hanley lot. The voice belonged to no one she knew. The word landed not as greeting, but as recognition, like when you answer your name in a roll call. Mallory waited for a person to enter the frame and explain the illusions we give ourselves when we watch an empty room long enough. No one did. Instead, the camera's focus shifted toward the black glass of the turned-off television, where something like a reflection began to show. It was not herself. It was the suggestion of a staircase behind her, wood darker than the floors in this room, rails braided with lamp shadow. The angle was wrong, impossible. It was as if the television were a window into a different place that did not care about the geometry of this address. A whisper came, clearer now. It said her last name, not entirely right, as if it struggled with the consonants. Then it said, "Don't face it." She did not touch the remote. She did not breathe for 2 beats. She did the thing the voice told her not to do. She stood up and stepped closer to the television until her own outline hovered on the glass. Her outline did not match the one in the tape. In the tape, the outline leaned toward the screen from an angle she could not occupy in this room. Her throat closed. She lunged for the stop button and punched it, then yanked the tape out like it might bite. Her fingers shook. She slid the cassette back into the padded envelope with the note and sealed it with a strip of tape like a bandage. She took the envelope to the sheriff's office with a tired half smile and a comment about pranks that get too personal. She did not want to keep that object in her building. Chief Whitaker, a man with kinder eyes than his jawline suggested, opened the envelope, looked at the tape, and said, in a voice that told her he had been waiting longer than she knew, "You should have brought this yesterday." He didn't mean to scold. He meant, this thing finds its way. He meant, we don't like bringing new names into its mouth. In a small room with a clock that ticked louder than a clock should, Whitaker, Doyle, Lena, and Mallory watched the tape together for precisely 1 minute and 8 seconds. The chief insisted on a timer. At 68 seconds, no matter what, he would stop it. He would unplug it from the wall if he had to. He said it like someone repeating a rule that is not written down but is followed because people who broke it could not bear to be the example. He pressed play. The room on the screen was the conference room they were sitting in, as if the tape had been made in the past hour. The chair where Mallory sat was empty in the image, as if in that version she had stepped away. The audio carried a sound none of them could mistake for anything else. The shuffle of someone climbing a narrow flight of stairs, the pause every 3 steps, the listening. Doyle put his knuckles on the table and did not move. Lena's lips parted, eyes fixed not on the screen, but on the window glass of the door to the hall, as if she expected to see a shadow pass by the small wired pane at any second. Whitaker's thumb hovered over the stop button from the first second. At 43 seconds, a whisper came. It said Mark, then Lena, then Mallory, then Chief, in a tone that somehow sounded courteous and delighted at once, as if the act of saying their names were a game. They all felt the floor vibrate. Doyle closed his eyes like a person bracing for a familiar pain. At 68 seconds, the Chief pressed stop with a flat palm that made the plastic button thwack. The tape rolled a fraction too long. The image shifted in that fraction, and they all saw, for less than a breath, the top landing of stairs none of them recognized, and the corner where a small hand lay on a nightstand, fingers flexing once. Whitaker unplugged the TV and the VCR from the wall and coiled the cords with a concentration that looked like prayer disguised as habit. He put the tape in a plastic case, like a lunch container, and lowered it into a locked drawer that did not look like it had ever held anything as ordinary as office supplies. He told them they would sign a piece of paper that said the envelope had arrived, that they had noted the contents, that the contents were not described beyond cassette. He did not say why the description was vague. He did not have to. Lena understood that to name a thing too precisely felt like an invitation. That night, Mallory sat up in bed at 2:17 a.m., alarm cold in her chest, because she had felt a shift on the mattress at her knees like a cat jumping up. She did not own a cat. She heard the soft, polite hello from the space near her closet, said in a tone that sounded less like a greeting and more like someone pronouncing a word out loud to learn what it felt like in their mouth. She did not turn her head. She moved her fingers very slowly to the lamp switch and turned on the light. The room looked exactly as she left it. The air, however, had that thickness of a stairwell where many feet have passed. She whispered into the lit room, "You can't make it let go," and surprised herself by crying without a noise. Days passed. The county moved on with the practiced amnesia of places that refused to let their worst things define them. A football game. A church bake sale. A rumor that the storage unit company had gone out of business because no one wanted to rent space on land where the ground remembered a table and a radio and a bed that faced a door at the wrong angle. Mallory wrote about other things, budgets and road repairs and a good kid who taught himself to tune pianos. She also visited a professor of media studies at the university one county over, a man who looked like a nice uncle and kept an oscilloscope on his desk for no reason he could explain that didn't sound like a hobby. His name was Leland Morrow. He listened to her carefully, hands steepled like someone pretending to pray, and then realizing they had continued to hold the pose because it helped them think. Morrow agreed to examine the audio from the tape without watching the video. He said the old VCR had an audio out he could patch into his own equipment. He said it would preserve his objectivity, then laughed because objectivity was a word academics use when they mean, "I need a ritual that makes me brave." They borrowed the department's machine and set it up in a lab that smelled like dust and old coffee. The waveform rose on his monitor like a soft mountain range. He found signal where there should have been nothing, and silence where signal should live. He found a narrowband tone riding the entire recording, sometimes drifting just above human hearing. He said, tearing his eyes from the screen with evident effort, "This feels like something learning to hum along." He asked if he could see 68 seconds of the footage with the sound muted. Mallory said no and felt something like relief flash through the room, as if the walls themselves waited for that answer. Morrow respected the refusal and wrote his notes with ink that seemed to dry too slowly, letters smearing at the edges like they wanted to move. He emailed her later that night with a simple message that consisted of 2 lines. The first line said, "You don't want to be right about this." The second line said, "But I don't think you're wrong." As with all things people don't entirely understand, a second tape eventually appeared, not because anyone sought it, but because this is how such stories sustain their own breath. It arrived not in the mail, but on a shelf in the back of the archive's cage, placed perfectly square on top of a ledger from a year when Lena had not yet been born. She only saw it because she felt a draft move along her ankles, as if someone who had just passed by had brushed the air. She stood absolutely still, afraid that if she moved too quickly, she would step into the place where the draft had been and discover that the absence had more shape than the presence. The second tape looked like the first, unmarked, no label at all. She used a marker to write "no" on both edges, then put it in a separate case and took it to Whitaker with a composure she did not feel. He did not want to watch it. He also could not imagine not watching it. He chose 68 seconds again. This time, before he pressed play, he said a thing he had never said out loud at work. He said, "If it says your name, you don't say mine in return." He didn't know why that felt like the rule, it just did. The second tape showed the Hanley house as it had been in those earlier sequences, but from a different angle. The camera sat on the landing upstairs, aimed at a door left slightly ajar. The hand on the nightstand returned, fingers flexing once, slow. The tone Morrow had described became a feeling along the gum line in the watchers' mouths, a faint ache like the anticipation of a storm. 30 seconds in, the audio, though muted, seemed to push at the edges of the room like pressure. 40 seconds. 50. Doyle counted in his head and found his counting didn't align with the seconds, as if the tape had its own minute hand. At 62 seconds, the door in the picture swung wider without a hand on the knob. The bed sat empty. The water glass was half full. The journal had shifted a fraction, the elastic band now slanting. A voice that none of them could hear because the sound was muted, nevertheless placed itself in the geometry of the room like a new piece of furniture, and Mallory squeezed her eyes shut because she felt her own name forming behind her teeth unbidden. At 68 seconds, the chief pressed stop with a controlled, almost sorrowing finality. The screen went blue, the VCR whirred, the sound horribly domestic. They decided then, not with a ceremony, but with the muscle memory of people who have survived storms, that the tapes would be locked in a metal cabinet against the far wall, and that an inventory would list them only as 2 cassettes associated with a closed property matter. No one spoke of destroying them, no one raised fire or hammers. There was a sense that smashing the plastic would be like breaking the surface of a pond with your hand and discovering that what lies beneath does not like its mirror breached. Life layered itself back on top of the fear. Halloween came and went. The first hard frost silvered the grass behind the courthouse. The storage unit company finally rented 3 units to a contractor who didn't live in the county and didn't know to ask questions he wouldn't like the answers to. People hugged each other in supermarkets. They argued at the gas station about a new traffic pattern by the high school. The world did what it does, pretending the strange thing is contained when it has only been put in a place where the lights are rarely on. Mallory kept a single page from Morrow's notebook on her refrigerator with a magnet from a diner not in Cleveland, but in Altoona, a magnet shaped like a piece of pie. On that page, Morrow had drawn a staircase with 6 steps and written pauses here, 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 as if the pattern meant something. She found it soothing in a way. She found it good to remind herself that people can name beats even if they cannot stop the measure from playing. When the phone rang once at night and stopped, and her caller ID showed her own number, she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and said to the empty kitchen, "I won't face you." The clock on the microwave ticked 1 minute forward, and nothing else moved. You can hear the story and tell yourself the tape is the villain. You can tell yourself the people who watched it were reckless, arrogant, naive. You can tell yourself you would have locked it away at once and never let it near an outlet again. Maybe you would have. Maybe you wouldn't have. The truth that settled over Mill County like a thin frost was simpler and worse. The tape was not just a thing that captured images and sound, it was a room that learned rooms. It was a staircase that practiced the weight of new feet. It did not swallow people whole. It waited until they answered when it spoke softly from the dark. It took names, the way ivy takes brick, slowly, patiently, without intending harm, the way a plant does not intend, but nevertheless cracking the mortar. There are still drawers at the sheriff's office labeled with neat, patient handwriting. There are still shelves where the lights go on and off on timers. There is still a metal cabinet against the far wall with a log clipped to its front. The cabinet is locked. The key is signed out rarely, always with another person present, always with the accompanying decision to stop at 68 seconds. In the deadest part of night, when the streetlights wash the sidewalk in the color of dishwater and the vending machines click as their compressors switch on, a draft moves along the floor by the evidence cage, and a dispatcher at a desk far down the hall hears a soft, embarrassed tapping on the archives door. If you ever find a cassette at the bottom of a box from a place where the ground remembers footsteps, if you ever read the words "do not watch" written by a hand that pressed too hard with the marker, if you ever feel a stair tread flex under your foot in a house with no stairs, keep your eyes on your own hands. Keep your mouth closed around your own name. Keep the television dark. The tape was locked away for decades, not because the images were obscene, not because the sounds were inadmissible, but because what it learns, it does not forget, and what it says back to you will sound so much like care that you might mistake it for kindness. Don't. When you hear the soft hello in a room that should be empty, answer with silence and walk away while your legs still know your weight. The terrifying secret hidden in plain sight. In the quiet town of Ashford, people often said that nothing truly bad ever happened there. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, neighbors waved as they drove past, and children rode their bikes freely through the streets until dusk. It was a town tucked away from the chaos of bigger cities, surrounded by thick woods that stretched for miles and bordered by an old railway line no longer in use. To outsiders, Ashford seemed ordinary, almost boring. But for those who lived there, there was always an unspoken awareness that something about the town didn't feel right. There were whispers, subtle things that people preferred not to talk about, but every so often a reminder surfaced and the silence became heavier. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? It was late autumn, the kind of evening when the sky turned a dull shade of gray long before the sun had set. The air felt heavy, damp with the scent of wet leaves. That night, a man named David was walking home from the small diner where he often had coffee after work. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional car passing by, headlights cutting through the mist. As he crossed Main Street, something caught his eye. A house just beyond the corner where Elm Street began. He had passed it countless times before, but on this night, it looked different. The blinds were always drawn, the windows never lit. For years, everyone in town walked past it without question. No one ever saw the owner, no cars parked outside, no movement behind the curtains. It was just there, standing quietly, as though it had been forgotten by time. But now, a faint light flickered in the upstairs window. David slowed his steps. The glow was soft, almost like candlelight, and with it came a shadow. A tall figure moved across the window, its head tilting unnaturally, as though it was aware he was staring. A chill rushed down his spine. He looked away quickly and continued home, forcing himself not to glance back. The following morning, when he mentioned it to a coworker, she frowned. "That house?" she said, her voice lowering. "You mean the Miller place?" She leaned closer. "Don't pay it any attention. It's better if you just don't look." Her words unsettled him more than the sight itself. For weeks, David tried to forget it. But every evening when he walked past, he couldn't help but notice. Some nights, the light was gone, the windows dark. Other nights, he would see the same shadow, moving back and forth, stopping suddenly, as though waiting for him. And each time, he felt a strange pull, a curiosity he couldn't explain. People in town began to notice his unease. At the diner, old men who gathered for morning coffee would fall silent when he asked about the house. A woman at the grocery store shook her head, muttering under her breath, "Not again, not again." Finally, one stormy night, he couldn't resist anymore. Rain poured in sheets, and thunder rolled in the distance. The streets were nearly deserted, the sound of water rushing into gutters filling the silence. David stopped in front of the house. The upstairs light was glowing again, brighter this time, and the shadow appeared almost immediately. Without thinking, he stepped off the sidewalk and crossed through the gate. The air seemed to shift the moment he touched the iron latch, colder, sharper, as though the storm itself had grown quiet just to watch him. The front door was unlocked. It creaked open slowly, revealing a hallway lined with faded wallpaper and dusty wooden floors. The air smelled of mildew, dampness, and something faintly metallic. The silence inside was deafening. He called out, his voice shaky, but no one responded. Slowly, he made his way toward the staircase. His shoes left prints in the dust, proof that no one had walked there in years. Yet upstairs, light poured through the crack of a door. When he reached it, he hesitated. His hand trembled as he pushed it open. The room inside was small, lit by dozens of candles arranged in a circle on the floor. In the center stood a chair, and strapped to it with fraying ropes was a mannequin, its head wrapped in cloth like a shroud. At first, he thought it was nothing more than an eerie display, maybe some strange joke. But then, the mannequin moved. Its chest rose, and a faint rattling breath escaped beneath the cloth. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a loose floorboard. Suddenly, the candles flickered wildly, though no wind had entered the room. The mannequin's head turned slightly, straining against the ropes, and the cloth shifted, revealing skin pale, bruised, and very much human. His stomach dropped. Someone was tied to that chair. He rushed forward, fumbling with the knots, but the moment he touched the rope, every candle went out at once, plunging the room into pitch-black darkness. A voice whispered, low and guttural, right next to his ear, "You shouldn't have come." David staggered back, heart pounding, searching for the door in the dark. The air grew heavy, thick, pressing against his lungs. Then the candles flared to life again, but the chair was empty. The ropes lay on the ground, cut clean, and the cloth was gone. The figure he had seen moments before had vanished. Yet the air still carried the sound of breathing, slow and steady, coming from behind him. He didn't remember how he got out of the house. The next thing he knew, he was standing on the street, soaked in rain, staring at the darkened windows. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his keys. That night, he locked every door, closed every curtain, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't erase the sound of that whisper. In the days that followed, something strange began happening. At work, he found objects moved from where he left them. In his apartment, the television would flicker on by itself in the middle of the night, static buzzing in the silence. Once, as he turned off the bathroom light, he caught a reflection in the mirror that wasn't his own, someone standing just behind him, face obscured by a cloth. He stopped walking past the house. He avoided Elm Street entirely, but no matter where he went, he felt watched. The shadow had followed him, hidden in plain sight. In crowded grocery aisles, he'd see the outline of someone too, still among the moving people. On the bus, in the reflection of the glass, he'd notice a figure standing where no one should be. At night, when he lay in bed, he would wake to the sound of ropes tightening, fibers straining, as though someone were struggling to break free in the dark corner of his room. Others in town began to notice too. They whispered when he entered the diner, eyes darting toward him before quickly looking away. One evening, an elderly man finally approached him, his voice trembling. "You went inside, didn't you?" he asked. David nodded slowly, unsure what else to say. The old man sighed heavily, shaking his head. "That place doesn't keep its secrets kindly. Once you see it, once you hear it, it never lets go." David never spoke of what he had seen again, but the changes were undeniable. His eyes grew hollow, his voice quieter, as though drained of something vital. Friends stopped visiting, unnerved by the feeling in his apartment, the way the air seemed colder, heavier whenever they entered. The town carried on as always, people avoiding Elm Street, pretending the house wasn't there. But everyone knew, deep down, the secret hadn't gone. It was still there, waiting in plain sight, behind drawn curtains and flickering lights. And every so often, when someone new passed by and felt the pull of curiosity, the cycle began again. Because in Ashford, the most terrifying things were never hidden deep in the woods nor buried in forgotten graves. They were right there, in the middle of town, waiting for someone to notice. And once you did, there was no escaping it.